All right, so it's time to go ahead and start. Okay, so today's lecture, the information in today's lecture all has to do with your final project individual. Your final project individual, you're designing a 4-bit multiplier. And I'm going to talk in detail today about the final project, both parts, the individual and the team part. But the lecture, we're going to start discussing what an accumulator is, which is a module of the binary multiplier. And then I'm going to give you some examples of how to do binary multiplication by hand. Because if you understand how to do the binary multiplication by hand, when we get to how the binary multiplier works, how the hardware works, and when we look at the state diagram, it should make sense. At least there's a better chance it's going to make sense if you know how to do the binary multiplication manually first. Okay, because what the hardware does is basically mimic what you do manually. Okay, so the activity today is going to be finishing our timing diagram for the binary multiplier that I'll start, and then the order of things is a little bit different than in the past, the previous classes we've had, because in the previous classes, I would give the activity after I was done talking, and once your table was done with the activity, if you didn't want to stay to do the lab, you could leave. But today it's different, because today, after you finish the activity, you definitely want to stick around, because after the activity, that's when I'm going to talk about the final project, and that's when I'll give you your midterm score, right? So after you get your midterm score, if you want to stay and work, that's fine. If you want to leave, that's also fine. Okay, so again, it's a little bit different. Not that different, just a little bit different. Okay. But we're going to start with the accumulator. Now, on each table, there should be 2 handouts. One handout has the code for the accumulator, system Verilog code. And the other one's the shift register handout that I passed out last week. Okay, that's just there for reference. So both these modules, both the shift register and the accumulator, they're part of the final project individual. And we give you these files. Okay, so later on in the class, I'll show you on Canvas that both those files are available, so you can just download and use them for your final project. Okay, but here's the symbol, block diagram, if you will, of an accumulator. It has a D input and a Q output, just like a register or a counter does. It has a load input. Okay, remember the load input, that's the same as an enter. It's got a clear input, you can see a clear input, at least 3 times before. And then also a clock input, because the accumulator does have memory. It's a sequential device. Okay, so the first thing to know about an accumulator is what its purpose is. It has a specific purpose. It keeps track of a running total. In fact, if you look at the code, right, so again, each table has this handout that has the system Verilog for an accumulator. Well, if you look at this code and it's just an if statement, can you tell me what's going to happen if the clear is not activated and the load input is? Now, both of those are active high. So if you have a 0 on the clear, it's not clearing, but it's loading. So can you tell me what load means in this case by looking at this code? Yeah, right. If you look at the if statement, if you're not clearing, well, then look at the else if, and that's an active high load. So if the load is 1, it's going to take whatever is on Q, add it to D, and then Q becomes that. Okay, so Q becomes the previous Q plus whatever is on the D input. And as long as you've got load asserted equal to a 1, it's just going to keep doing that. So that's how the accumulator keeps track of a running total. right? The output is just continually, as long as you leave the load equal to 1, it's just going to continually add whatever's on D to Q and put the new result on Q. Okay? All right, so this is when Q, now actually I forgot to ask this question before. So let me ask it now, because I don't want to give it away when I write this. There's an obvious, or what should be an obvious typo in this code. Does anyone know where the typo is? It's actually the next thing I was going to write there. What's the typo? This isn't always FF block. So what do you know about always FF blocks?
Yeah, what's called the non-blocking statement.
Right. You need the arrow, right? The less than with the equal. You see how it's just an equal? But remember, the equal is how you assign an output in the always cone. Right? It's always FF. Right? You got to have that arrow when you assign. Right. So if you're loading, it's going to assign Q to the previous Q plus whatever it's going to be. Okay, how about if now you know what I mean by the double dashes, right? I'm just repeating what's above. So what occurs if the clear is still 0 and load is 0? What if both clear and load inputs are 0? What's the accumulator going to do? Looking at the code. What's going to happen if we're not loading and we're not clearing? It's going to what? Yeah, it's just going to keep what it has, right? Because remember we talked about this? That's how you can create memory in system Verilog is if you have an if statement and you don't have an else, then not having the else creates a latch, and that's memory. So this is the storage. It's going to store, right? It's just going to keep the previous Q. You know, next state of Q is just going to be present state of Q. Okay, so that's how an accumulator works. Right, when you're loading, that's when it's keeping track of a running total. Right, if you're not loading, not clearing, then it's just going to store. All right, so any questions on the accumulator? Now you're going to see that this is part of your final project individual. This accumulator is going to be a module in the 4-bit binary multiplier. And also in your 4-bit binary multiplier is a shift register. Okay, so that's why I put that handout from last week on the table about the shift register, so you could refer to that when we get to the binary multiplier. Okay, so any questions up to this point about the accumulator? Pretty straightforward, right? Just like a register and counter, it's just get that feature of keeping track of a total, right? Okay, so the next thing is to talk about how you would manually multiply 2 binary numbers, because if you understand how to manually multiply 2 binary numbers, it should make more sense when we get to the circuit that does it. Okay, just like before you design that sign binary adder subtractor, right? We talked about how to manually add and subtract by addition manually, right? So same sort of thing, just we're multiplying here. So I got 3 examples, because I think the best way to learn this is just through example. And in each of these examples, the top binary number I'm labeling A, and the bottom binary number I'm labeling B. So first of all, before we actually multiply these in binary, tell me what this binary number is in base 10. 111 is what in base 10? And how about 110? What's that in base 10? 50. So yeah, we're just multiplying 7 times 6 in binary. Okay. So the way you do this is that you look at B. Okay, you look at this second number here, and when a bit of B is 0, we're just going to add 0 to whatever total we have. And when a bit of B is 1, we're either going to add A or we're going to add a shifted version of A. And we'll see, when you add A and when you add a shifted version of A coming up. Okay, but let's go ahead and proceed here. So I first look at the least significant bit of B. Okay, and as you see here, the least significant bit of B is a 0. So since it's a 0, I'm just gonna put 0 as the result. Okay, because here's where my running total is going, right? Okay, now I look at the next bit of. Okay, this bit is a 1. When this bit, the one that's left, the next left to the least significant, well, I'm gonna add a shifted version of A, and because it's this bit, I shift A one place to the left. Okay, so I take A and I put it in my total, but I shift it one place to the left. Okay, it should make sense that we're shifting left, because last week, what did we learn about if you have a shift register and you shift left and you put in a 0? What effectively have you done? Yeah, you multiply by 2 every shift to the left as long as you put in a 0. Right? Okay, but now we get to this bit, and it's a 1. And when this bit is a 1, we take A and we shift it 2 places to the left. Okay, so I take A and I shift it 2 places to the left, and now I add these. Okay, so you see that 0 came from this bit of B being a 0. This 1, 1, 1 came from this bit of B being a 1. I shifted A one place to the left, and then when this bit of B is a 1, I take A and shift it 2 places to the left. And now I just add these together, like you normally do. So these are all zeros here. 0, 1 plus 0, 1. 0 plus 1 plus 1 is going to be 0, carry the 1. Then 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3, so 1, carry the 1. So I end up with that, and I can check my answer, right? Because I can convert it to base 10 and see if we get 42. No 1s, I got a 2. No 4s, I got an 8. No 16s, I got a 32. Right, so 32, 8, and 2, 42. Right, so you see it worked. Okay, so any questions on that example? No, we're going to get to other examples that have the bits for B in a different place. Okay, but any questions specifically on this one? Everybody see what I did here? Can you see why hardware that does binary multiplication would need a shift register, right? Because we need to shift based on what bits we have for B. And can you see why it would need an accumulator, right? Because we can get to the total by just having a running total as we go through the bits. Okay. All right, but let's do this one. Let's do this example. What am I multiplying here? In base 10, what are these? 5. Yep, I'm just doing 5 times 5. Right? Okay, so what's different in this example than the previous one? In this example, the least significant bit of B is 1. Well, when the least significant bit of B is 1, you just add A, you don't shift it. Okay, so I just take A and I don't shift it when this bit is a 1. Okay, then we get a 0. Now, no matter what bit, when it's 0 for B, you just add 0 to the total. Okay, and then like before, when we get to this bit, when this bit of B is a 1, we take A and shift it 2 places to the left. So let's see, 2 places to the left, and 1, 0, 1. Okay, and I would add these. Now, where I'm not writing anything, of course, there's zeros. Okay, so let's see if this comes out right. So 1 plus 0 is 1, 0 plus 0 is 0. 1 plus 0 plus 1 is 2, so it's 0, carry the 1. 1 plus 0 is 1, then we just have 1 here. So I have a 1, I don't have a 2, I don't have a 4, I have an 8, I have a 16, so that's 25 base 10, so it comes out right. Okay? So any questions on that one, right? I'm just doing the same approach. The only thing that was new here is when this bit of B is 1, you just take A, you don't shift it. Okay, so any questions on that one before we get this? This is the doozy one. Right, we have all ones. Because what are we multiplying here? From base 10, we're multiplying
31.
Is this 31? What are these two numbers? Like, what's this number in base 15? Okay. Yeah, off by 1. So we're going to do 15 times 15. What's 15 times 15? 225. So we should get 225 as the answer. Now, I'm gonna need more space here, so I'm gonna erase this one. So no questions before I erase this? Okay, so we're just following the same procedure here, and since B is all ones, we're gonna have A added to a shifted version of A, shifted one place, added to a shifted version of A, shifted two places, added to a shifted version of A, shifted three places. Right, because we don't have any zeros for B, so we don't add zero in there. Okay, so I gotta be careful of lining this up. Sometimes when I don't line this up, I get a sound. Make errors. So anyway, that's the first, based on this bit. Then this bit, I just shift the bits over one place. And for this bit, I shift the ones over two places. And then for this one, we take the ones and shift it over three places. And half the battle is just keeping these columns lined up. Okay, and then we just got to add these together. Okay, so 1 plus all these zeros, just 1. Okay, 1 plus 2 zeros, that's a 2, so it's going to be 0, carry the 1. Okay, so now we get to something we haven't seen. Right, because I add these two, right, which is a 2, so 0, I carry this 1, and now in this column here, I got 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. Now, the most ones we ever added at once in a column, when we were doing binary addition was 3, right? 1 plus 1 plus 1, which is 1 carry a 1. But here we have 1 plus 1 plus 1, which is 4. And as you know, 4 in base 2 is 1, 0, 0, right? 1, 0, 0. So this is what I can do. This 0, I write right here. And then I can carry these two other bits. See, this 0 goes to the next column. And then this 1 goes 2 columns over. Okay, so you see what I did? This 0, goes right here. This 0 goes to the column right next to this one. And then this 1 goes to the column to the left of where I put the 0 that I carried. Right? So essentially, we're carrying these two bits. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, now I just keep on going. So now I got 0, 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, which again is 4. So I write the 0 here. This 0 would go here, and this 1 would go here. I just did the same thing. We're just one column over. Okay, and then I got 1 plus 1, 0 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, which again is 4. So I got 0, carry the 0. 0 to this column, carry the 1 to that column. Okay, and then I got 0 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, which is 3. So that's 1. Carry the 1. Then I got 1 plus 1 plus 1, which is 3. So 1 and 1. All right, so let's see if this came out right. I got a 1, no 2s, no 4s, no 8s, no 16s. I got a 32, I got a 64, I got a 128. Right, so 128 plus 64 plus 32 plus 1, 12, 14, 15, 5, carry the 1, 3, 9, 12, 2, carry the 1. So 225. It works. Okay, so these are the key things that you got to remember, so that when you do your 4-bit multiplier, hopefully the hardware makes sense to you. Key thing is, B is telling you what to do, right? You're looking at B, you're looking at the bits of B, and if a bit of B is 0, you're just adding 0 to the total. Again, it doesn't matter where that 0 is. It can be any of the bits. You're always going to add 0 if a bit of B is 0. But if a bit of B is a 1, you're either going to add A or a shifted version of A, right? If the least significant bit of B is a 1, you just add A, right? But if this bit is a 1, you shift A over one place to the left and add that. If this bit is a 1, you shift A over 2 places and add that. If this bit is a 1, you shift A 3 places to the left and add that, right? If you had more bits, it'd be the same idea. Okay? So any questions on any of these examples? Okay, because I think if you understand how to do binary multiplication by hand, the circuit should make sense to you, or at least some sense. Okay, all right, so that's what we're gonna do next. Let me turn the camera before I forget. Be good. Okay, so here is the final project individual diagram. Question. Oh, that's a great question. Well, for what we're doing in this class, it's unsigned, but you know, there's surely multiplication of signed binary numbers. It's just not. Let's see. I would have to research to see if it's the same procedure because I haven't actually done it. But I have a feeling if it's not the same procedure, it's similar. It's probably that you just have to sort of ignore the signs in it because you know, the actual value would be done either in the same way or very similar. But you know, as you're, you know, like if you had like a sign bit, that sign bit wouldn't tell you like whether to add 0 or shift because it doesn't have a meaning of like a power of 2. Yeah. So I guess my quick answer to your question is that it would be similar but not exactly the same because yeah, that sign bit doesn't have numerical value. But yeah, that's an excellent question. In fact, that could be something that a person could do for like a final project team. You know, they could take like the idea of this binary multiplication unsigned and maybe come up with a circuit that does sign. You know, that would be like a possible idea. I haven't seen anyone do that one, but that's one that, you know, would probably be a good project team. Okay, but this is the structural model. This is what you have to do for your final project individual. And you can see there's 4 modules, but of these 4 modules, 3 of them we give you. The only one you have to design is the FSM, okay, this multiplier FSM. So you have a shift register, okay, SR stands for shift register. So this shift register has the same code that you have on that handout. We supply the file. Okay, you don't have to copy the text like we did with the universal say. This is an actual file we give you. Also, the accumulator, we give you this. Okay, these are on Canvas. You just download them, put them into your project that you're going to use for your individual final project. And then this is Mealy's module, the one that you use for lab 5. Okay, same one. So that one there, you know, you had to copy and paste the text, but now you have it, right? Because you needed it for lab 5. So you can just bring it over from lab 5. Okay, you already have the file. Okay. So, like I said, this is the one that you're going to have to design, the FSM. And look at how these modules are connected. Okay. Okay, here's our shift register. Well, first of all these modules are synchronous, right? They all have some sort of memory. You got your time multiplexer, you know, Dr. Mealy's. Accumulator has memory, shift register has memory, FSM has memory. And you can see they all have clock inputs. They all connect together and go to this main clock, right? Again, these are your main inputs. Here's your main output. Shift register, right? It's got a clear, but notice, look, the clear has this symbol here. You've seen this symbol before. What's this symbol?
Ground.
Ground. And in the code, how do you take care of that? Yeah, you just set that input to 0, right? You connect it to 0. So the clear is an active high for your shift register. So by grounding clear, it's never going to clear. Okay, because for this design, we never want the shift register to clear. Okay, for this design, we always want the shift register to depend only on the select input. And remember, when we talked about the shift register, and you can see it in the code here, the select input is a 2-bit input, right, which gives us 4 options. And what are the 4 different modes for the shift register? Like, what are the 4 different things that the shift register can do? Like, for example, when the select line to the shift register is a 1, what's going to happen? You look at the code. Right, it's just going to take D and assign it to the output Q, and that's what we call loading, right? When we load a register, any kind of register, that's just taking whatever's on the D input and assigning it to the output Q. And look what the D input of the shift register is connected to. It's connected to A. It's connected to this number that we want to multiply. Okay, so when the select is a 1, it's going to load A into the shift register, meaning that the Q output of the shift register is going to become whatever A is.
And so A is 4 bits, and then the shift register is 8 bits. Do we mean you just load the last 4 zeros then and that contaminate them?
Right, yeah, and can you guess why the Q has to be 8 bits?
Because if you have, we did the example of 1 or the 15 times 15, and the maximum you can get is 8 bits out of 4.
Yeah, exactly. Because our result can be up to 8 bits. Yeah, that's why it's 8 bits. But yeah, when this gets loaded, the least significant bit of A is going to be the least significant bit of these 8 bits.
So it's going to override any previous, no matter what. When we load it in, it's essentially going to clear it and then add it, but we skip this step of clearing because we loaded in. It's already
Well, because we essentially disabled the clear, what the shift register starts at, like its Q output, it's going to be some number of bits. Now, we don't know exactly what it's going to be, but we don't really care until we load A anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So A, in this case, A is sort of like your initial value, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah. Once you load it that. Now, remember, well, we'll get to that. But right now, it's just important to realize that A is what gets loaded into the shift register. Okay, when we have the select line equal to a 1. Okay, how about if the select line is equal to a 2? What is the shift register going to do? What's option 2 in the code here, the case statement? Say that again. Shift left, exactly, right? You look here, it's going to do a shift left. Okay, which is probably something we want to do, right? Because what we're doing when we manually multiply, right? Based on what the bit value of B is, right? We'll shift left if the bit value is a 1. Do you think in this design, the shift register select line will ever be a 3? No, why not? Right, exactly. This is a multiplier. When you shift right, which is what would happen if you make the select line equal to 3, you're shifting right. That's when you're dividing, right? That's a divide by power of 2. So yeah, in this design, this multiplier design, you'll never see that select bit input equal to a 3. Okay, how about if that select input is a 0? What's going to happen? Yeah, that's the store. So Q is just going to remain whatever it was previously. Okay, so for this shift register, if our select line is 0, it's just going to keep the previous value of Q. If it's a 1, it's going to take whatever's on the D input, which is A, and make it Q, right? Assign it to Q. And if it's 2, it's going to shift whatever it has left one place and put in a 0, which again is effectively a ×2. Now look where this select input is connected to. This select input is connected to an output of this FSM that you're going to design. All right, so you see it's this FSM that's going to determine what the shift register is doing. Because it's going to provide the select bits, whether it's a 0, 1, or 2. Okay? All right, well, let's look at the accumulator. Okay, the accumulator, notice first, the output of the shift register goes to the input of the accumulator. So whatever's at the output of this shift register, it's also at the input of this accumulator. And what did we say earlier? We said earlier that the accumulator basically does two things. If it's not clearing, right, what happens if you clear it? Clear is the same as reset. So what happens when you reset something?
Zero.
Yeah, the outputs just go to zero. So this accumulator, if you're not clearing it, it's doing one of two other things. You're either loading it or it's just remaining the same, right? If you're not loading it. And when you load this accumulator, it's going to take whatever's at the output of the shift register and assign it to Q. Okay? And then look where the clear and the load of the accumulator go. They also go to the FSM that you're designing. So you see this FSM that you're designing, it's controlling what the shift register and accumulator are doing. All right? See, this is called an FSM controller, right? Because it's controlling other modules. And here we're controlling it to do that, right? To multiply two binary numbers. And then look, this should make sense. Look at this. The B input, right? The second number one we're multiplying, that's what's going to the FSM. Doesn't that make sense? Why does that make sense? Right, right, because when you manually multiply, it's B that's determining what's going on, right? Whether you're adding 0 or a shifted version of A or just A. So you see, that's why B is going into the FSM. Because the FSM is looking at the bits of B and then telling the shift register and the accumulator what to do. That make sense? Okay, and then you have Mealy's module. Mealy's module is just doing what it was doing in lab 5, right? It's doing that time multiplexing so we can use more than one 7-segment display to show whatever the result is. Notice that unlike in labs 4 and 5, where you had to determine validity of your addition or subtraction, here we're just connecting the valid to 1, and we're just saying the result is valid. You're not doing any sort of validity check on this multiplication. Okay? So that's the structural model for this 4-bit multiplier. Now, the next thing we're going to do, unless you have some questions, is we're going to look at the state diagram, right? Because when you design this FSM, just like when you design any FSM, you start with the state diagram. In fact, I got a few emails over this past weekend, people that were, doing lab 6, right? The sequence detector. Now remember, the sequence detector, that's due this Friday. That's the next thing that's due. And also remember, Thursday's an open lab. Okay, we don't have lecture or anything on Thursday. So, you can come in then and you have the whole lab period to work on whatever you want to work on. But I got a few emails this past weekend, and I could just tell by the way that, the email was worded, that I had a suspicion. I was like, I wonder if these people have done a state diagram yet, because they were talking about like how to code the FSM, or, they had some general questions for lab 6. And sure enough, when I replied back and I said, have you done a state diagram yet? They're like, oh, we're supposed to do that. And it's like, yeah, you shouldn't even open Vivado until you have a state diagram. Okay, because remember, once you have the state diagram, like I showed, I guess it was last week when we first talked about FSMs, is that you can essentially take that state diagram and go into that format that I gave you for an FSM modeled in System Verilog. Okay, so don't even think about going and doing any code until you have a state diagram. Okay, so this is the state diagram. This is the state diagram that we have for the 4-bit multiplier. And, I have to give credit where credit's due. This is Dr. Benson's design. This is not my design. I have a different state diagram for my design, but it's not as eloquent as Dr. Benson's. Okay, this is a very clever design, and I'll explain why as we go through it. Okay, but with any state diagram, you always have to have a legend. Now, when we get to, what you have to do for the final project, you're going to see that for the final project, especially the team portion, I require you to submit more things, more material than what you had to, during the quarter for your lab work. And one of the things for your final project that you need to submit is a state diagram. And I can't tell you how many times I've looked at what people submit for their final project, and they have a state diagram and they have no legend. And if you don't have a legend, I don't know how to read that state diagram, or no one would know how to read it except you, okay, because you got the legend in your head. Okay, so don't forget a legend in the state diagram that you pass in, because you lose a lot of points that way. All right, but let's review this, because we've talked about this. Okay, what does the circle represent in a state diagram? It represents a state, right? Each state gets a circle. Okay, then you just have your name of the state that you can call whatever you want. Okay, now inside the circle, these outputs, see the three outputs of our FSM, they're all within the circle. So that means they're what kind of output since they're inside the circle? Right, there are more outputs. Because remember, more outputs only depend on the state you're in. Okay, we have an enter over here. This enter is asynchronous. Okay, then we have the curved arrow. What does the curved arrow represent? And notice the arrows are what's in between states. So what happens to go from one state to the next state? Give you a hint. Clock, right? An edge of a clock. So that's what this curved arrow represents, is a clock transition. Okay? And then here, this B bracket with number sign. What would we call that? Just generally speaking. I know this is a bit of B, but generally speaking, what do we put here in a state diagram? Is this an output?
No, it's not, but,
Yeah, it's just an external input. Okay. What's this? Right, this is a mealy output. Okay, now this brings up something you haven't seen yet in state diagrams. Notice, accumulator load is here where you put a mealy output, and it's also here where you put a more output. See, it's in both places. And the reason for that, as you're going to see when we get to the state diagram, is because for a portion of the state diagram, the accumulator load only depends on the state, so therefore it's a more. But then for another portion of the state diagram, the accumulator load not only depends on the state, but it depends on this input, which is one of the bits of the B input. Okay, and that's why it's a mealy. So you see, you can have designs where an output is sometimes a more and sometimes it's a mealy. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the actual state diagram now for this, for the binary multiplier. So the first thing is, as I mentioned earlier, the enter is asynchronous. So the way this is designed, once the enter is asserted, okay, once it becomes a 1 in this case, because it's active high, it's going to take us to the start state. Here I named this, or Dr. Benson named this, the start state. Now, here in the hold state, you can see that SR select is a 0, accumulator load is a 0, accumulator clear is a 0. So if SR select is a 0, that means the shift register is just in the store state. Right, so whatever is on queue to begin with, right, it's just going to keep it in the hold state. And then when accumulator load is a 0, that means the accumulator is not being loaded. Right, so that also means that the Q output of the accumulator is just going to remain whatever it was. And then accumulator clear being a 0 means that in the hold state, the accumulator is not being cleared. So again, in the hold state, both these outputs just keep whatever their previous values were. All right, but now you get an enter. And because it's asynchronous, doesn't depend on the clock, it's just going to put us into the start state. And when you're in the start state, and you all know what I mean by the double dashes, I just mean the same thing up here. I just didn't feel like copying it down. So in the start state, the SR select becomes a 1. So what happens? What does the shift register do again when the select is a 1? Right, so it's going to load in this state. It actually, let me write it on the other side. You'll see why when I eventually I'm going to put something over here, so that's why I don't want to write on this side. So when the SR select is equal to a 1, the shift register is going to be loaded with A. Right, because as we talked about earlier, the input of the shift register is connected to the A binary number that's part of our multiplication, right? So that's going to get assigned to Q, okay, when the shift register gets loaded. Okay, accumulator load is 0. So accumulator is not loaded. So it's just going to remain whatever it was, its output. And then also accumulator clear is a 1. So the accumulator gets cleared. So what does cleared mean again? Yeah. So in the start state, the Q of the accumulator is going to be made all zeros, right? Because that's where we want our running total to start, right? Remember, that's what the accumulator is going to be doing. It's going to be keeping track of this running total of the results, right? We want to start that running total at 0. So that's why we clear the accumulator in this start state. Okay. All right. Well, what do I have here? If I don't have anything written next to a clock transition, right? Because remember, this arrow represents a clock transition. So if I don't have anything written next to it, what does that mean?
Next cycle forward.
Right. Remember, that's an unconditional transition. So it just means, enter puts us into the start, and then the next clock edge, we go to the next state, which is the bit 0 state. And when you're in the bit 0 state, the SR select becomes a 2. So what does that do to the shift register? What's the shift register going to do when its select is a 2? Right, it puts it into shift left. Now notice, I don't have accumulator load anymore in the bubble, because once you get to these bit states, now accumulator load becomes a mealy. Because now what's going to determine whether we load the accumulator or not is what the B value is, what the bit of B is. And we'll get back to that, why that's so. But then also in all these bit states, we're not going to clear the accumulator. See, the accumulator clear is 0. So it's not clear accumulator. In fact, if you look at all these bit states, right, all 4 bit states, they all have the same thing, right? Each one of them, the shift registers set up the shift left, and each one of them, we're not clearing the accumulator. And then each one of them, what we're going to do with the accumulator, whether we're going to load it or not, depends on what the B value is. And this is where the design's very clever, because the way Dr. Benson set this up is that for each bit, she's doing a shift left, but then depending on what the bit is, we either load the accumulator or we don't. And if you don't load the accumulator, even though the shift happened, since you're not loading the accumulator, it's just going to keep what it had previously, which is the same as adding 0. All right. See, we only load the accumulator when the bit value of B is 1, right? Because that's when we want the accumulator to update, right? Because we'll take that version of A, if it's the first bit, it's not shifted, but if it's the second bit, it's shifted 1 place, next bit 2 places, next bit 3 places. And if that bit of B is a 1, we'll load the accumulator. But if that B is 0, we don't load the accumulator, which is the same as adding 0. I'll get your question in just a second. I did this a different way. My multiplier, my state diagram has more states, and it's more brute force. Because with my state diagram, if a bit was 0, I actually add 0. I actually add 0. But you see, that's why this is clever, right? Because not loading the accumulator is the same as adding 0. And that's what made it, a more eloquent design. You had a question?
Oh, yeah. So we're shifting left at bit 0 before anything happens. If we start off with the 1 in this case, aren't we already adding a shifted version of that?
Your question is getting to the next thing I'm going to show.
Oh,
okay, yeah, because to answer your question, I think in a clear manner, we have to look at the timing diagram.
Oh.
And what your question is getting at is that, even though the enter is asynchronous, everything else is synchronous. So remember, when you have a synchronous input, it's not enough just to have the active value. You also need the edge of the clock. So you see, even though we have these values in this state, the shifts and the loads won't occur until we get the clock transition. Okay, and that's what I'm going to show in the timing diagram. Okay, so yeah, that's an excellent question. And if people have difficulty with this, it's usually that. It's usually when they look at the timing diagram, like things kind of look off. And the reason they kind of look off is because they're supposed to, because when you have a synchronous input, it's not enough just to have the input active, you've got to have the 0 to 1 clock transition. Okay, and you'll see what I mean when I put up the timing diagram in just a minute. But are there any questions? Well, I guess the main thing that I'm trying to show at this point is that, can you relate what this state diagram is doing to what we did manually, right? And also how these modules are connected, right? Because if you understand how to do the multiplication manually, it should make sense to you that, hey, B goes to the FSM, right? I got to look at B to determine what I'm going to do, right? And why A goes to the shift register, because that's the thing that's going to get shifted based on the books of B. Okay. All right, so let's look at the timing diagram, and this is actually the activity. I'm going to show you the timing diagram for this, and I did part of it, and then the activity is I want you to finish it. Okay, so I just wake up the computer, turn on the projector here. This should be coming out. Oh, here it comes. Okay, so this timing diagram, a couple of reasons I wanted to go over this. One is, this is the way that you're going to have to verify whether your simulation for your multiplier is working, once you get that far in Vivado, right? Just like the other designs, you got to look at the timing diagram that your simulation produces to see if it's actually doing what you want it to do. And then another reason why I wanted to go through this is because this form in, drawing out a timing diagram before you actually look at one in Vivado, you're going to have to do this in CPE133. Okay, you'll see in that class for various different instruction types, you're going to have to come up with, a timing diagram for each one. And what I found teaching that class is that usually if there's a hard time understanding one of these, it goes back to what a synchronous input means. Okay, so I wrote up here, just as a reminder that the enter is asynchronous. So that's the only input that doesn't depend on the clock. All the other inputs depend on the clock. This timing diagram is showing the example 7 times 6. So it's that first example there that this is showing. And you can see up at the top, we have the clock. And remember, the clock is just a periodic square wave. So it just goes on and on here. And then I have the state names. So you see, we're starting in the hold state. And then you can see it's the start. Now, the start, since it's asynchronous and, you're going to have the enter button that you press to get to the start state, or you're going to have this enter as a button on your basis board, right? That you're going to have to press to get to the start state. And, depending how long that button is pressed, that's going to determine like how long this actual enter signal as a high. I made it 2 cycles. It's likely to be much more than that, right? Because I don't know, when you press a button, how many nanoseconds is that? It's quite a few nanoseconds, but anyway, I just kept it, as you can see here, high for 2 cycles, but that could be any number of cycles. But then after the start, it follows this state diagram, right? We have bit 0 state, bit 1 state, bit 2, bit 3, and then it ends in hold. So let's start here at the hold state. So when I, came up with this timing diagram to get SR select, accumulator load, and accumulator clear, I just look at my state diagram and I just look right here and I go, okay, SR select's a 0, accumulator load's a 0, accumulator clear is a 0. Okay, so you're just getting these right from your state diagram. Okay, then underneath the accumulator clear, this is SR contents. Okay, so shift register contents. The shift register contents is what's at output Q. And then below shift register contents is accumulator contents. Accumulator contents is what's at the Q of the accumulator. Okay, so we're in the hold, but remember, we're in the hold, and then to get out of hold, you have to assert enter, right? So this is where enter goes high, and because it's asynchronous, it doesn't depend on the clock. So as soon as this enter signal goes high, now we're in the enter state. Enter takes us to the start state. Okay, so in the start state, SR select is a 1, accumulator load's a 0, accumulator clear is a 1. Okay, but here's the key thing, and this is where understanding synchronous comes in. SR select is a 1, meaning that Q is going to be updated with what's connected at D, which is our A, our 7. So look, during the time that SR select becomes a 1, the SR contents remains what it was, which it started as a 0 because that's what I initialized them to. It doesn't actually get loaded to the new value until this clock edge occurs. So you see, even though SR select became a 1 here, right, the minute that we went into the start state, the actual load doesn't occur until this clock edge. So you see how it was a 0 all during the time of the start, but then at the beginning of the next, the beginning of the next clock cycle, that's when the load actually happens. See, that's due to the fact that this select is a synchronous input. If it was asynchronous, then it would update to a 7 right when that input went to a 1, when this select went to a 1. But because it's synchronous, it takes the clock edge in addition to that input being asserted. You had a question?
Not.
Okay. Same thing with the clear, right? Clear becomes a 1, so it's asserted here. Now, I initialize my values to 0, and since clear makes the output 0, you won't see a change, right? Because it started at 0. But if the accumulator contents had started at some other value other than 0, you wouldn't see the clear, you wouldn't see the accumulator output go to 0 again until that clock edge happens.
So that makes sense. I was wondering, doesn't it like kind of have the same problem that we had the one input going down or the other one going up? Like you might have the unknown values if something's changing and you're also reading at the same time.
Well, that's not occurring here, right? Because the change in the input is happening way before. See, it's happening at this time. So it's happening, it's happening at a time way before this clock edge.
Oh, okay, so it almost has like an entire clock cycle just to
Correct.
stay the same.
Right, exactly. And you see, that's the thing that can be confusing to people, right? Because see, they look and they see that this went to a load and they're expecting the output of the shift register to change right then in the same state, but it doesn't change because it's synchronous. It doesn't change till the next edge comes along. So it's as though at the beginning of the next cycle it happens. So, people that don't realize that, they think everything's skewed. They think everything's off by a clock cycle, but it's supposed to be that way because the inputs are synchronous. right? And you see in CP233, you're gonna have a timing diagram like this with like 50 signals, and most of them are all synchronous. So that's always gonna happen. You're gonna see the input change, but then you won't see the output change until the next clock cycle. Okay, so that's the main thing I wanted to show you here. Now, let's continue on here. I mean, you stay and start for 2 clock cycles, like I said, but now let's say we get to bit 0. Okay, the bit 0 state right here. Okay, so in bit 0, the shift register select becomes a 2 because now we're in shift left mode for the shift register. The accumulator clear is going to be a 0 because we don't want to clear. And now what we're doing with the accumulator, whether they're going to load it or not, depends on what the bit value is for B. Right, so here we're multiplying 7 times 6, just like that first example. So the bit 0 value here is going to be a 0. Right, so that's why you see a 0 for the accumulator load. Right, because if bit 0 is a 0, accumulator load's a 0. Because even though we're shifting A, because bit 0 is a 0, we're not going to load the accumulator, and that's just like adding 0. So in the timing diagram, see the shift left of A, which is our shift register contents. See, it doesn't happen until this clock edge after the select first became a 2. See how it goes from a 7 to an E. So you see that was a shift left, right? Because if I have 7, right, 0, 7 in hex, right, 0, 1, 1, 1, these are all zeros, of course. Well, if I do a shift left 1 place and bring in a 0, I would have 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0. Right, and this is so you see this 7 go into an E, that's a shift of 1 place to the left, right? The output of the shift register. But because I'm not loading the accumulator, because the bit 0, 0, see the accumulator output just stays the same. See, it's going to stay a 0. And then when we get to bit 1, another shift left happens. Well, I won't tell you, you got to do this part. But the part I will tell you is that when you're in bit 1, that's when our bit for B is a 1. So we do load the accumulator, right? And when the accumulator gets loaded, that's the output of the shift register becomes the output of the, the output of the accumulator becomes the shift register output plus whatever was there at the output of the accumulator to begin with, right? Because it's Q plus D. And because there was 0 there to begin with, well, it's just going to take 0 plus E. And now that's at the output of the accumulator, but it doesn't happen. The output of the accumulator doesn't update until this clock edge here. Right, so even though the load's occurring under bit 1, it doesn't actually occur until the beginning of the next state. Okay? So does that make sense? I mean, the big thing here is just seeing the effect of the synchronous inputs, right? That it's not enough to have that input asserted. You've got to have the clock edge. Okay?
So when you have arrows, it's following the previous memory.
Yeah, that's my, instead of writing this over again, I'm just saying it's keeping that value wherever you see that arrow.
Yeah, so like since this like takes time with the clock to like run through all the bits, there's points in time where the display is like showing the wrong number, but it's like very short time. If you understand what I'm saying?
So you're talking about like at the output of the accumulator?
Yeah.
Well, it would just keep for each clock cycle, it's just going to display what's there. I mean, remember, this is happening in nanoseconds, right?
Yeah.
So it's just whenever the display gets updated, you'll see that update.
But if you were to like slow the clock down,
Oh,
then you would see like each, update.
yeah, I mean, well, the thing is, I mean, also, I mean, I see what you're saying, like, right here, if we're just looking right here, but we also have this module of Mealy's that's doing the time multiplexing, which in order for that thing to work, it has to be at a high frequency. See how this clock goes to the main clock, like we're not slowing it down. So yeah, I mean, in this particular design, even, in addition to what you're saying, if you have a slow clock, that time multiplexer module of Mealy's isn't gonna operate correctly either. Like you would actually start to see, like, it wouldn't be a steady number anymore, it'd be all flashing. So I mean, your question's a good one. It brings up the point that, yeah, you do have to be concerned with like clock speed. But for what we're doing here, this particular design, you're not gonna see any delay or anything when it gets updated.
Yeah, I'd like a value for the hold state, you put the value for 1 for the FSM. Yeah, 0 valid for everything else, and then once it's done.
Oh, okay. Yeah, like keep it, yeah, I see what you're saying, like keep it just like invalid.
Yeah,
until
because
it's-
the validity means it shuts it off for the time that it's doing the calculation.
Well, remember, the way Mealy's module works is that if it's not valid, it actually shows dashes.
Oh, yeah.
But you could change it, you could go in the code, and when it's
hold,
not valid,
sure.
just keep it blank. You could do that, yeah, so. No, those are really good questions. Those are insightful questions. Yeah, so the activity is, I just want you to complete this. Like I went up to bit 1, right? I went up to here. I just want you to fill in, what these would be for bit 2, bit 3, and hold. Now, remember, these here, these 3 outputs, they just come right from the state diagram. All you got to do is look at each of those states, see what they are, and just write in the numbers. The shift register contents for each bit state is going to be shifting to the left. So, this is going to continue to shift 1 bit to the left for each of those bit states. The tricky part, if there is a tricky part, is when the accumulator gets loaded, right? Because again, the accumulator is only going to get loaded when the bit of B is a 1, right? If it's a 0, it's just going to remain what it was previously, right? Because again, that's the same as adding 0. Okay, so work on the activities at your at your tables, just like you've done previous activities. The answer's up here, right? So the answer is up here, so you can check your answer. And like I said at the beginning of the hour, what's different this week is that I'm going to wait until I have all the activities passed in. And then once I have all the activities, I'll talk about the final project, and then I will give you your midterm scores and make some comments about the midterm. And then we're basically done for today.
So on when you go from bit 0 to bit 1, the accumulator load goes from 0 to 1. All right. So that part there I have a question, because when you go from bit 0 to bit 1 on the time diagram, we're doing E equals, so we're doing the first one. So
Right.
bit 0 of B is a 0, right? So shouldn't be on, you can see like the state transition, if B0 is 0, shouldn't load also be 0?
Yeah, it's right here.
Yeah, so why does accumulator load go to 1 after that transition?
Because this one is now this bit.
I thought that happened on the transition between 1 and 2
Well,
though.
Well, no. Well, what's happening on the transition is whether the accumulator is being loaded or not. Right?
So I guess I'm misunderstanding how the diagram works. So we're going from bit 0 to bit 1.
Yeah, so bit 0, right? Well, for all these bits, what SR select is, what accumulator load is, and what accumulator clear is, it's always the same, right? It's always 2, 0, 0, because for every bit, you're shifting the contents of the shift register 1 place to the left. But then what's determining whether you load the accumulator or not is what the bit value is.
We're never shifting. Oh, wait, are we shifting B? Is that why? Or
No, we're shifting A. See, A is going into the shift register. B determines whether you load the accumulator or not.
yeah. I will look at it one because I'm like looking at the accumulator load, and when it goes to 1, I thought that we're reading when we're in the B1 state. I thought that, the cumulative load was determined by B0 from the
No.
state diagram.
No. When you're in bit one, right, when you're in the bit one state.
Yeah.
As you're going to the next state, because it's synchronous, you're looking at that bit to determine whether you're loading the accumulator or not. See, the reason we're putting the accumulator load as a mealy at this point is because it depends more on the state. It not only depends on the state, but it depends on what the bit value is too, whether we're gonna load it or not.
Okay, so then I'm off on the timing diagram, because I thought that, during B1, we'd be looking at the previous, muley and not the arrow pointing into bit one versus out of bit one.
Okay, well, does bit zero make sense? I
Yeah.
mean, it seems like you're concentrating on bit one, but I mean, bit zero, like for all these different bit states, it's the same thing, right? That, you know, these values here are being determined by, you know, the more outputs, right? It's just that, well, when I point to the more outputs, I'm talking about the SR select and the accumulator load. But once you get to the bit states, now the accumulator load, it's a mealy because it depends more on the state. It also depends on what this bit value is.
Yeah.
And again, it's synchronous, so here, you know, because the accumulator load is a 0, we're not gonna load the accumulator, so that's why, you know, it just stays the same, right? It was a 0 and it stays a 0, right? But now we get to this state and the accumulator load becomes a 1 because the bit value, that bit of B that's, you know, to the left of the least significant bit, right? Because it's a 6, that would be a 1. So now the accumulator gets loaded, but again, the load doesn't happen until this edge. So that's why you don't see the 0 change to E, you know, what's at the output of the shift register until this time.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll have to look a little bit more, because I'm like, just still confused, I can figure it out.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, when you start working on it, like maybe when you work on this part, it will
Yeah.
become clearer, so. And are there any other questions? Okay, so let me turn the lights back on and like I said, work on that activity. And then once I have all the activities, that's when I'll continue on about the final project and also hand out your midterm scores.
There we go.